The Galactic Academy's grand auditorium shimmered with anticipation as students from across the Milky Way gathered for the final evaluation in advanced xenolinguistics. The lecture hall, carved into a crystalline moon orbiting the gas giant Kuliros 7, was a monument of intellect and technology. Its walls pulsed faintly with stored linguistic data, whispering the recorded remnants of 1,000 extinct alien languages. A hush fell over the room as Professor Exaloran entered. Tall, thin, with iridescent skin that shifted hues with his emotions. His species, the Kalari, communicated through sonic inflections so nuanced that only artificial neural implants could distinguish tone from meaning. He walked to the center platform, his 6 fingers clasped behind his back, and his gaze slowly passed over each of his students. Among the seated crowd were representatives from no fewer than 42 planetary systems, species with tentacles, horns, translucent skulls, and in one corner, a single human. Jack Lewis sat quietly, a pen tucked behind his ear, not because he needed it, but because it helped him think. His dark brown hair was tousled as usual, and his fingers drummed lightly against the desk. He was the only human to have ever qualified for the advanced xenolinguistics program, and though many respected him, some of his classmates regarded his success with silent skepticism. Professor Exaloran raised his voice, amplified gently by the acoustics of the hall. Today marks the culmination of your studies in interspecies communication. You have all been trained to observe, to adapt, to decode. But true mastery lies in making sense of what has never before been understood. He tapped the air before him, and a holographic field emerged. Within it hovered a 3-dimensional image of a creature that looked almost like a massive jellyfish encased in a crystalline cocoon. The organism's body glowed with dozens of bioluminescent tendrils, flickering in rhythmic pulses. This is a Jüken, the professor continued, a sentient life form discovered 2 cycles ago in the Veil Nebula. There is no record of successful linguistic contact with their kind. No syntax, no lexicon, no auditory emission. Communication appears to be solely based on light signals, patterns so complex that even the Galactic Translation Corps has failed to produce coherent interpretation. A low murmur passed through the audience. Many students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Jürkens were the stuff of myth in academic circles, enigmatic, untouchable, the holy grail of xenolinguistic puzzles. This is your final examination, said the professor. Each team will be granted 1 simulated encounter with a Jürken emissary in a controlled environment. Your goal is simple: establish mutual understanding. You may use any tools, knowledge, or assistance permitted under the Galactic Academic Code. You have 48 hours. He paused. I do not expect many of you to succeed, but remember, in failure lies the seed of mastery. The lights dimmed as the hologram dissolved. Students erupted into discussion, already forming clusters, debating tactics and historical precedents. The Ulvarn twins from Sector 3.14 began cross-referencing previous attempts from failed research missions. A group of Mycorans began reviewing visual language matrices. Others simply stared at the fading image of the Jürken, overwhelmed. Jack remained seated, his mind already running through possibilities. He recalled reading about the Jürken in a buried database on Earth, mostly speculation and grainy transmission footage. No verbal sounds, no tactile signals, just endless waves of light, undulating like a coral reef caught in starlight. He looked up as Professor Exaloran began walking past the rows of seats, observing students with his penetrating stare. When the professor stopped near him, Jack met his gaze calmly. "You are alone, Mr. Lewis," Exaloran said with a hint of curiosity. "You do not wish to form a team?" Jack shook his head. "I work better alone, sir." "Confidence is admirable," the professor replied, "but the Jürkens have driven entire research departments to madness. Do not mistake solitude for insight." "I won't," Jack said quietly. Professor Exaloran gave a faint nod and moved on. As the auditorium emptied into breakout chambers, Jack took his time. He walked the corridors of the academy alone, his footsteps echoing softly. Despite the grandeur of the architecture, the walls had always felt cold to him. Beautiful, yes, but sterile. It reminded him how far he was from Earth, from home, where languages evolved from need, where words came from struggle, intimacy and culture. He eventually reached the simulation chamber assigned to him. It was a spherical room with a glass-like dome overhead where simulated stars twinkled. In the center was a holographic recreation of a Jüken emissary, motionless for now, but ready to respond once the test began. He studied the creature's shimmering lights for several minutes. The patterns were not random, he could tell that much. There was rhythm, there were pauses, pulses, bursts, almost like music. Jack sat cross-legged in front of the creature. Instead of diving into analysis, he just watched. He let the lights wash over him like waves, resisting the urge to immediately break them down. The others would be building translation trees and reverse signal maps. He wanted to understand the emotion behind the light, not just the structure. He remembered what his grandmother once told him when he was 5 years old, trying to understand the barks of the family dog. If you stop trying to make sense of it, you might actually hear what it's saying. He whispered to the empty room. "What are you trying to tell me?" The Jüken's light pulsed faintly. No movement, no change. He activated his neural interface, allowing his thoughts to stream through a HUD projected in front of his retina. His implant wasn't as advanced as what the Kylari used, but it was designed to interface with almost any language database. Instead of pulling up linguistic data, he accessed something different. A pattern recognition AI from Earth, initially built to analyze classical music structures for digital remastering. If the Jüken communication resembled soundless melody, maybe it could serve as a foundation. He ran a short loop of the creature's light patterns through the AI. Instantly, the software began identifying motifs. It highlighted recurring pulses, mirrored sequences, and even what it called visual rhymes, sections where light patterns reflected earlier ones but with subtle changes, like refrains in a song. A grin touched Jack's face. This wasn't a language in the traditional sense. It was more like a living waveform, a frequency dance, one designed not just to convey information, but emotion. Connection. The test hadn't even officially started, and already he had a theory. Elsewhere, the other teams were compiling data trees, assigning colors to phonemes, attempting to invent a grammar where none existed. Jack, however, was letting the creature lead. He had no desire to force a human understanding upon something so clearly alien. Instead, he wanted to meet it halfway. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small, spherical drone, one he used for note-taking and occasional simulations. He reprogrammed its lights manually, adjusting the output frequency to match the bioluminescent spectrum of the Jüken. Then he initiated a pattern, nothing complex, just a gentle ripple mirroring one of the Jüken's earlier sequences. For a moment, the Jüken remained still. Then it blinked. Once, twice, the same sequence. Jack leaned forward, heart racing. It had responded. He hadn't even tried to speak yet. He had simply listened, repeated, and acknowledged. The Jüken pulsed again. This time a longer sequence, more intricate, but still rhythmic. Jack's drone responded. To an outsider, it might have looked like a child's light show, flashes and flickers in the dark. But to Jack, it felt like a handshake across the stars. He stood slowly, eyes locked on the creature. The impossible task had just become possible. In the high-ceilinged observation chambers of the Galactic Academy, the simulation environments buzzed with activity. Each team of students had been assigned its own enclosed lab, complete with advanced holographic interfaces, environmental regulators, and access to pre-approved linguistic toolkits. It was the most realistic setup the Academy had ever created, designed to mimic the conditions of real first-contact missions. These chambers, arranged in a vast circular formation deep within the moon's underground complex, operated independently. No student could see what the others were doing, and that isolation only added to the mounting pressure. Professor Xylorn watched the surveillance feeds from the central command hub, his expression unreadable. He stood behind the semi-panel viewing screen, observing the behavior of each group in silence. A holographic interface displayed student biometrics, progress indicators, and energy usage. He could see who was focused, who was panicking, and who was wasting precious time running down dead ends. His translucent fingers twitched occasionally as he made minor annotations into his personal evaluation log. No amount of preparation could compensate for a mind unable to think outside of protocol, and he had designed this challenge to break routine thinkers. In Chamber 12, a team of 4 Mycorians sat in a triangular formation around their assigned Jüken simulation. Their elongated heads glowed faintly under the chamber lights, each pulsing in sync with internal biocurrents, an evolutionary trait that allowed them to communicate silently with one another. The leader, Vros, manipulated a floating panel displaying the recorded light patterns emitted by the Jüken over the last 5 minutes. He believed he had found a sequence that repeated every 17 seconds. His companion, Shar, argued that it was a misinterpretation, and that the sequence was actually a mirrored structure, not a loop. The two debated in flashes of internal light, their emotions sparking visibly through the veins under their skin. The third Mycorn, Della, attempted to construct a basic translation matrix, assigning numeric values to the brightness of each light burst. She hoped that a pattern would emerge if she categorized them by amplitude. She worked silently, chewing her lower lip in frustration as the matrix grew more chaotic the further she mapped it. The fourth member, Norx, paced in circles. He had begun the assignment confident, even arrogant, boasting that his species' superior memory would allow him to crack the code faster than the others. Now, just 4 hours in, his confidence had evaporated. The Jüken had responded to none of their efforts. In Chamber 17, a hybrid team consisting of 1 Sarthian, 1 Grolith, and 2 Halinavarians huddled around a projection grid. The Sarthian, tall and covered in translucent scales, had proposed using harmonic resonance to disrupt the creature's signaling long enough to trigger a reactive communication. His logic was that the Jürkens might only speak under pressure. The others reluctantly agreed, and they constructed a small resonance disruptor using the allowed component. When activated, it flooded the chamber with a subtle vibration field meant to irritate the simulated creature. The result was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Urkon simulation went entirely dark, unresponsive to further stimuli. The team was stunned. The Halnavarian female slammed her fist into the control panel, shouting that the simulation had entered a dormant state. The Grolith attempted to reset the system, but the console flagged a warning: invasive interference detected, session lockout initiated. They had violated the protocol. Their test was over, prematurely and irrevocably. In Chamber 5, another group took a more passive approach. A trio of analytical species, known as the Varn-2, meticulously catalogued each Jürkon light pulse, hoping to find repeating numeric strings. They logged every flash, every dimming moment, every duration, compiling it into a linguistic database that soon ballooned past 2 million entries. The system lagged under the weight of their calculations. Each of the 3 Varn-2 operated with surgical precision. But their flaw was the same one the professor had seen for decades, an over-reliance on data without instinct. There was no attempt at emotional context, no imagination. By the 10th hour, they had developed hundreds of possible interpretations for a single pattern. Yet none matched the next signal. In Chamber 23, a lone Kailari female named Arissa sat motionless before her Jürken. She had chosen not to build anything, not to analyze. Instead, she meditated, opening her mind to the frequencies of the creature's light. Her species, known for emotional resonance and abstract perception, often excelled in intuitive problem-solving. For a moment, her inner aura began to shimmer, her energy field reaching toward the simulation. The Jüken pulsed gently. It was unclear if it was a response or coincidence. She leaned forward, whispering a sequence of harmonics through her inner vocal organs, frequencies only audible through the walls of the simulation chamber. The Jüken paused, then pulsed once. She smiled faintly, but the pattern did not repeat. The simulation remained neutral. She tried again, but this time the creature's pattern diverged sharply, faster and brighter. She sat back, uncertain if she had moved forward or simply been noticed. Throughout the chambers, frustration brewed like a storm. Heated arguments broke out between teammates. Accusations of sabotage, arrogance, and incompetence echoed in private audio logs. Several students requested rest periods, exiting the simulation chambers with pounding headaches and dry throats. The intensity of the task was beginning to wear down even the most resilient among them. Back in the command hub, Professor Xylorn reviewed the data. He focused on a timeline graph showing cumulative engagement versus output across all teams. Only one simulation stood out, Chamber 31. Its interaction showed a steady incline in pulse-matching events and minor reactive shifts in the Jürken's baseline light signature. He zoomed in. Jack Lewis, the only human. Xylorn frowned slightly, pulling up the live feed. The human sat cross-legged, hands folded in his lap. He made no movements, spoke no words. A small spherical drone hovered beside him, pulsing gently with soft light. The Jüken, meanwhile, was glowing steadily, its patterns no longer chaotic but moving in slow, almost meditative rhythm. It appeared calm. The professor narrowed his eyes. He noted that the human had not requested additional tools, had not pulled data from the linguistic archives, had not filed a single frustration log or assistance request. For most students, silence meant stagnation. But here, it felt different, purposeful. He turned away from the screen and addressed his assistant, a younger Kilari named Ven. Prepare midterm observation reports. Include anomaly patterns for Chamber 31. Yes, Professor, Ven replied, already keying in the commands. In the observation wing, students began to spiral. Some gave up entirely. One group, led by a hot-tempered Zorthian male, dismantled their signaling device and rebuilt it from scratch, convinced the error was mechanical. Another team attempted to shift their approach to chemical signaling. Despite knowing it fell outside the Huracan's known sensory spectrum, the halls between chambers grew quiet. Some students sat against the walls with heads in their hands. Others quietly revised personal statements in case of failure. The pressure of being among the galaxy's best students, in the most advanced academy, facing an unsolvable problem, was beginning to break spirits. And still, the clock ticked. By the end of the first day, only 2 simulations showed active light pattern exchanges. Arissa's and Jack's. The rest had stalled or collapsed into static repetition. In his private log, Professor Xwine wrote only one sentence. The alien mind cannot be unraveled by force. Only those who listen will ever hear it speak. And in Chamber 31, Jack sat in silence, watching the Urkin's glow ripple like a heartbeat through the dark. Jack's eyelids twitched slightly as the low hum of his neural interface pulsed against the inner edge of his skull. He had been sitting still for nearly 8 hours, yet not a single second of that time had been idle. His mind had been racing, tunneling through algorithmic branches, adapting signal response trees, and sketching a communication architecture based not on grammar or structure, but on emotional mimicry, rhythm, and feedback. The small spherical drone beside him now emitted a soft, responsive glow that echoed the Urkon's pulses with remarkable fluidity. He wasn't trying to translate the creature's language, he was trying to speak with it. Across the chamber, the Urkon floated silently. Its jellyfish-like body shimmered in fluid, unpredictable waves of turquoise and amber. Jack had come to recognize some of the pattern groupings, not as words or even ideas, but as mood sequences. There were bursts he mentally labeled as curiosity, longer, slower undulations that felt like neutral patience, and sharp flickers that could only mean withdrawal. Once, after his drone had pulsed a pattern too quickly, the Jüken had recoiled with a flash so intense it had disrupted the simulation room's light sensors. That flash, he believed, had expressed something like alarm or rejection. He had cataloged none of this data conventionally. Instead, he built a feedback model in his neural HUD, something between a virtual mood board and a reactive emotional compass. Each time he observed a pattern, he responded with another, logging the effect, adjusting for variables. His AI assistant, a low-level learning core he affectionately named Soul, after nearly a full day of experimentation, Soul displayed a steady loop of successful exchange rates, each marked not in linguistic success, but in reciprocal pattern evolution. Jack smiled faintly. This wasn't just communication. This was bonding. He stood slowly, stretching his limbs for the first time in hours. His back cracked loudly in the otherwise silent chamber. The Jüken remained still, but its lights pulsed with soft blue tones, a pattern he had come to associate with observation, maybe even expectation. He walked to the control panel and opened a secure development environment. From the corner of his mind, Soul whispered data points into his focus. Pulse intervals, wavelengths, symmetry values. He converted those into logic gates, not for direct translation, but for mimicking emotional congruence. Instead of building a translator in the traditional sense, Jack began constructing an empathy core. His fingers flew over the interface, pulling open a new model within the AI system. He'd created layered response protocols that could interpret pulse shifts in real time and mirror the sentiment with calculated delay, tone, and brightness. The code wasn't complicated, but the logic behind it was radical. Instead of trying to assign meaning to alien signals, the empathy core sought only to reflect feeling, to meet an emotional frequency and stay in resonance with it. By the time the second day cycle began, his prototype was ready. He uploaded the code into the drone, reinitialized its operating system, and stepped back. The device powered up, spun slightly in place, and emitted a gentle ring of pulsating lavender light. Jack didn't touch it, he just watched. The Jüken responded. Its light expanded outward, slower than before, but unmistakably directed. Its central body glowed with repeating bands of violet, gold, and a new hue Jack hadn't seen yet. Deep coral red. Sol pinged a response. New pattern detected, symmetrical alignment with previous output, likely response to empathic feedback. Jack laughed softly. It's working. The drone emitted another ring, this time modulating speed and rhythm based on Sol's prediction. The coral hue returned, pulsed once, and then again, but brighter. The Jüken shifted slightly in its simulated tank, its tendrils lifted. It began pulsing in wide, slow spirals. Jack's HUD lit up. The simulation had entered active exchange mode. He activated a log sequence, not for the Academy, but for himself. Every neural response, every light pattern and resulting reaction was documented. He had done what no other had even attempted, bypassed language entirely and formed a real-time empathy protocol for cross-species bonding. Back in the Academy's central hub, Professor Xylorn watched the feed with narrowed eyes. He saw the live graphs. The Jüken's pulse intervals had stabilized. Its neural simulation showed increased stimulation in areas associated with receptivity. He had seen nothing like it, not even in the failed diplomatic attempts 2 years prior when the Galactic Council had sent envoys to the Jüken homeworld. Those emissaries had returned empty-handed, some mentally shattered from the psychic dissonance caused by exposure to untranslatable communication. But this human, this Jack Lewis, had not only remained sane, he was progressing. The professor silently walked away from the hub, leaving his assistant in charge, and descended toward the observation chambers. He rarely visited students during evaluations, but protocol allowed discretionary visits when anomalies warranted further review, and this was no ordinary anomaly. Inside Chamber 31, Jack sat on the floor again, facing the Jüken. His drone hovered between them like a glowing mediator. Sol whispered updates every few seconds, interpreting rhythm, glow density, and sequence variety. Jack no longer needed to look at the interface. His body knew what the next step was. It was like a dance or a duet between silent partners. Then something new happened. The Jüken blinked off. Completely, its lights vanished. The room darkened. For a moment, Jack's heart stopped. He waited. 30 seconds. Nothing. He stood slowly, unsure. Sol flagged the situation. Signal dropout. No response from entity, awaiting stimulus. Jack held his breath, then took a risk. He walked slowly toward the Jüken. When he reached the boundary marker, he knelt, placing his hand on the floor. He directed the drone to emit a soft circle of warm amber. Nothing complex, just a glow. The Jüken remained dark for 5 more seconds. Then, without warning, it flared into light. But this time the pattern was unlike anything Jack had seen before. It wasn't pulsing. It wasn't reactive. It was language. The light moved in complex loops, like glyphs drawn in the air. Spirals overlapped, crossbeams shimmered. Jack's HUD began flooding with data. Sol, for the first time, hesitated before speaking. New signal class detected. Recursive structure. Probable information exchange. Formal protocol. Jack fell back slightly. It's trying to talk. He watched as the Jüken continued. Its glow wasn't random. It was intentional, hierarchical. Jack realized something. The empathy loop had triggered a gateway. He hadn't translated the creature. He had earned its trust. And now it was offering a bridge. He instructed Sol to begin recording, but not to interpret. Not yet. This wasn't about instant understanding. It was about presence, awareness, the willingness to meet without demanding conversion. Behind him, the door slid open silently. Professor Xylorn stepped inside. He said nothing at first, only observed. Jack turned, surprised but not alarmed. The professor's gaze shifted from student to drone to Jüken. "You did not ask for help," he said quietly. "I didn't want to interrupt anything," Jack replied. The professor took a few steps forward. He tilted his head slightly. "It's communicating in formalized recursion. A linguistic core born from conceptual response, not grammar. Fascinating. Jack nodded. I think it's showing me how it thinks, like inviting me to understand, not to decipher. Professor X. Lorne's expression softened. You approached it without fear, without need to conquer. That is unexpected. From a human. Jack smiled faintly. Maybe the problem wasn't that the Jürkens don't speak. Maybe it's that we've all been yelling so loud we never noticed when they started whispering. The professor did not reply for several seconds. Then, with a nod, he turned to leave. As the door closed behind him, the Jürken emitted a final sequence of spiraling coral red symbols. Saul chimed softly. Sequence stored. Emotional resonance high. Potential initiation of new exchange protocol, Jack whispered, more to himself than to Saul. Then let's listen. The spiraling sequence of coral red lights lingered in the air long after the professor's footsteps faded into silence. Jack stood motionless in the middle of the chamber, his eyes locked on the Jürken's slowly pulsing form. Each glowing arc that looped through the creature's body felt like a sentence being spoken in an ancient dialect of emotion, and although Jack couldn't yet parse the specifics, he felt the intent deep in his bones. Saul whispered rhythmic notations into his neural feed, frequency values, pulse delays, interference readings, but Jack barely noticed. He wasn't reading data anymore, he was listening with his instincts. The Jürken's form glowed brighter, shifting from coral red to a spectrum of hues Jack hadn't seen in any known light palette. He blinked, unsure whether the tones were real or being translated by his brain into colors it could comprehend. The creature's tendrils moved gently in the simulated gravity, like ribbons suspended in water. The light that pulsed through them now formed interlocking shapes. Two spirals converging, lines twisting in on themselves before blooming outward again in symmetrical patterns. Jack's heart pounded. This wasn't randomness. This was an attempt at structure, possibly even narrative. He sat cross-legged again, this time in absolute silence. The drone hovered beside him, waiting. He didn't issue any commands. Instead, he closed his eyes, letting the light from the Jürken wash over his face. In that stillness, he remembered a conversation with his mother when he was a child. Watching lightning storms from their cabin window, she had said, "Sometimes the sky doesn't want to be understood. It just wants you to sit with it while it tells its story." He had never forgotten that. The Jürken pulsed again, this time sending a burst of light directly toward the drone. It hovered slightly backward in response, then corrected its position and returned a smaller, circular glow in soft lavender. Saul's voice was calm. Responsive feedback confirmed. Sequence interpreted as invitation. "Shall I proceed?" Jack nodded but didn't speak. Saul didn't need verbal instructions now. The AI had synced so closely with Jack's emotional cadence that most commands passed through intention alone. The drone blinked once, then sent out a pattern Jack had labeled mirrored curiosity, a soft, triangular sequence interlaced with measured pauses. The Jürken responded instantly. Its pulses widened in breadth, drawing what appeared to be angular constructs, shapes that flickered in and out like ephemeral architecture. Saul flagged the pattern as geometric recursive, which, in AI terms, suggested a higher-order communication attempt, a symbolic lexicon formed through shape repetition. Jack leaned forward slowly, the corners of his mouth lifting. He was watching the birth of a visual language, built from shared curiosity. More importantly, he realized the creature had shifted its behavior. It wasn't just responding anymore, it was teaching. Saul whispered, "Initiation of instructive loop suspected. Pattern threshold exceeding baseline. Simulated entity offering structured expression. Model. Memory graph expanding." Jack whispered back, "Let it continue, just observe, don't interfere." The drone dimmed its light, entering passive recording mode. Jack did the same. He stopped trying to react. He simply watched. For over 20 minutes, the Jürken projected light in sequences that evolved with each cycle. Triangles became pentagons, spirals fused into helixes. At one point, the creature flared in a radiant cascade that formed a rotating glyph, a closed loop within a square, surrounded by 4 shifting colors. Sol flagged it as self-referential entity identifier, suggesting that the Jüken had shared a representation of its own concept of self. Jack inhaled sharply. That single construct, something so seemingly abstract, was more than a symbol. It was the first genuine offering of identity from the Jüken. Not just a response, not just a reaction. It was saying, "This is me." He reached forward slowly and touched the drone. The device glowed softly, then emitted a new pattern. 3 concentric circles intersected by 1 horizontal bar. It was Jack's best attempt at conveying a human silhouette, stylized in light. The Jüken paused. Its colors dimmed, then flickered once, twice. Then it emitted the original rotating glyph again, this time surrounded by a ring of green pulses. Sol responded immediately. Sequence updated. Pattern variation suggests recognition of reciprocated identity symbol. Emotional elevation detected in light modulation. Jack exhaled slowly. He had done it. Not just initiated communication, but exchanged names, or rather abstracted representations of identity. That was the threshold for mutual recognition in almost every known form of intelligent communication. The moment when 2 minds said, "I see you." As if acknowledging the gravity of that breakthrough, the Jüken drifted slightly closer within the simulation. Its light turned a soft ocean blue, forming an undulating wave that moved from left to right before resetting again. It repeated the pattern 3 times. Sol's analysis was hesitant. Sequence does not match previous classification, no recursive logic detected. Suggestive of initiation of new conceptual set, perhaps emotional state or environmental reference. Jack didn't answer immediately. He was watching too closely. The wave repeated again, and then he saw it. The slight shift in timing. The forward ripple slowed just a hair. The return ripple followed more quickly. The blue darkened slightly with each cycle. He spoke softly. "It's demonstrating time." Or memory. The next sequence confirmed his theory. The Jüken sent a light burst that began with a rapid flash, then expanded slowly outward, like a shockwave rendered in light. The entire chamber brightened briefly before dimming back to baseline. Sol pinged again. Sequence comparable to event progression model. Possible representation of moment of change. Jack looked up at the creature, his eyes wide. "You're telling me a story." The chamber lights shifted with the intensity of the Jüken's projection. It moved faster now, its tendrils undulating with deliberate rhythm. Shapes emerged, some simple, some dizzyingly complex. Sol tried to analyze them in real time, but eventually gave up and switched to full passive recording. There was no point trying to understand what hadn't yet been mapped. Jack didn't care. He was immersed. He sat motionless as a tale unfolded in silence and light. It was impossible to describe in words, but the feeling it gave him was unmistakable. The creature was speaking not just to his mind, but to something deeper. To the part of him that listened to music without needing lyrics, that stood in awe at the edge of thunderstorms, that cried at paintings without understanding why. When the final sequence pulsed, a slow cascade of violet fading into gray, the room grew still. The Jüken dimmed, returning to its original soft amber glow. Sol's voice returned, quiet and slow. "End of sequence detected. Emotional resonance nearing peak. Memory log saved." Jack opened his eyes. He hadn't even noticed he'd closed them. He whispered, "Thank you." The Jüken blinked once. Just once. Then it returned to baseline. The chamber door hissed open. This time it wasn't the professor. Then the assistant from the command hub entered cautiously, holding a small data tablet. His long, slender frame was slightly hunched, as if unsure whether he was interrupting something sacred. Jack turned and stood. "Is something wrong?" Ven shook his head. "No, but the professor instructed me to notify you. The simulation record from this chamber has been forwarded to the Galactic Archive Council for review." Jack blinked. "Already? The sequences you've unlocked triggered automatic escalation protocols. You've breached unknown communication structure thresholds. No other student has ever reached this phase with a Jüken simulation." Jack didn't answer. His eyes wandered back to the silent, softly glowing form of the creature. Ven hesitated, then added, "Also, the Council has requested a formal debrief. You'll be expected to explain your method, your code, your approach." Jack ran a hand through his hair. I didn't use code. Not in the way they'll want. Ven tilted his head. Then what did you use? Jack looked back at the drone, then at the earcon. I listened. I didn't try to translate. I let it speak. Ven stared at him, his expression unreadable. Then he simply nodded, stepped back, and let the chamber door close behind him. Alone again, Jack sat down and faced the creature once more. This time, he didn't initiate anything. He just waited, and in the soft flicker of the chamber light, the Urkon began to speak again. The Urkon's glow returned to its calm amber rhythm, and the simulation chamber exhaled a soft mechanical sigh, as if even the artificial environment understood that something profound had occurred. Jack remained seated on the floor, still facing the creature, though now he sat with less urgency. He was no longer deciphering, reacting, or calculating. He was witnessing. The light spoke with him in delicate rhythms, not out of obligation or fear, but out of trust. He had crossed a threshold not by conquering a puzzle, but by surrendering to the possibility that understanding didn't always begin with decoding. It could begin with presence. Professor Exelorn entered the chamber in complete silence, his movements slower than usual, his expression more composed than ever. His robe shimmered faintly in the dimmed lights, and he stopped a few steps inside the room, allowing the gravity of what he was witnessing to wash over him. The feed from Jack's chamber had long been cut from the main hub. After realizing the exchange had reached levels of interaction, he watched the Jüken's patterns unfold and evolve. The movements were no longer raw emotion or primal reaction. The symbols floating in light were structured, elegant, and subtly layered. They echoed, they returned, they refined. He recognized the recursive architecture. He knew the indicators of cognitive mirroring. This was no longer simulation. This was communion. He waited until the sequence dimmed again, then finally stepped forward. Jack looked up as the professor approached. He didn't stand immediately. His body was still vibrating with the residue of emotional intensity. The moment hadn't faded. It lingered in his bones. Professor Exelorn stopped at arm's length. For a few seconds, he didn't speak. He merely looked at the human student sitting calmly on the floor, the Jüken floating behind him, and the glowing drone hovering beside him like a silent witness. The professor's voice, when it came, was quieter than usual. Not soft, but reverent. You were never trying to solve it, were you? Jack stood slowly and brushed his hands off against his trousers. His voice was hoarse. I stopped trying to solve it the moment it responded to me. After that, it didn't feel like a task. It felt like a conversation. The professor nodded once. That is what all true linguists eventually learn. The best conversations are not performed. They are shared. He moved closer to the Jüken, observing the residual shimmer of its light. It showed you something more than pattern recognition. It attempted projection of thought, of memory. Jack glanced at the floating creature. It told me a story. One I didn't understand with my mind, but I felt it completely. I think that's how it begins. Not with vocabulary, but with shared emotion. Professor Exelorn turned toward him. And how did you manage to build the empathy core? Jack scratched the back of his neck. Honestly, I didn't build it in the traditional sense. I just gave my AI parameters based on what I felt. Every reaction was driven by mood, not logic. I kept adjusting the outputs to match my intuition. Eventually, it started responding in ways that made sense, not mathematically, but emotionally. The professor's eyes narrowed. You created a translator not of language, but of intent. Jack shrugged. Maybe. I think I just listened long enough to be invited in. There was a long pause. Professor Exelorn stepped back and folded his arms. His tone changed. Not colder, but firmer, more official. You understand the magnitude of this event. Jack met his gaze. The Galactic Archive Council has reviewed your interaction. They're calling it the first successful initiation of spontaneous symbolic communication with a non-syntactic species. Jack nodded. I figured it would get attention. It will get more than attention, the professor said. It will rewrite contact protocol across 23 exploration sectors. It will demand new frameworks for communication, training. Entire divisions of the Academy are already petitioning to access your logs. Jack sighed and sat back down on the floor, legs stretched in front of him. I'm not sure how much I can explain in technical terms. It wasn't exactly step by step. That is precisely what terrifies them, the professor said. The idea that it wasn't solved through code or lexicons, but through emotional openness, through silence and patience, through being human. He paused. You've embarrassed many in the academic elite, Jack, but more than that, you've humbled them. Jack smiled faintly. Good. Maybe it'll help the next time someone meets a species that doesn't think like us. The professor didn't return the smile. Instead, he stepped toward the control panel and deactivated the simulation. The Jüken faded slowly, leaving behind a trail of luminescent particles that dissipated like stardust. Silence returned. Jack stood. What happens now? Professor Xylorn turned toward him, hands behind his back. Now you become the reference. Jack tilted his head. What do you mean? The council will request formal debriefings, dozens of them. You'll be asked to consult, to teach, to define methods you never intended to formalize. Your experience will become the foundation for a new approach to xenolinguistics. Jack swallowed slowly. I didn't come here to be a symbol. Symbols rarely volunteer, the professor replied, but that doesn't stop the galaxy from assigning meaning to them. He looked Jack up and down, then added, You will be offered advancement. You'll skip several years of formal academia. You'll be placed on the First Contact Development Task Force if you choose, and I suspect you'll be asked to lead it before long. Jack took a long breath and let it out. He stared at the spot where the Jüken had floated. I just wanted to understand something no one else could. And you did, the professor said. But now comes the hardest part. What's that? Teaching others how to unlearn everything they've ever been taught so they can listen like you did. Jack gave a bitter smile. That's the real exam. The professor turned and walked toward the exit. Class dismissed, Mr. Lewis. As the door slid shut behind him, Jack stood alone in the quiet chamber. The simulation was gone, but the memory of the exchange still buzzed faintly in the air. He walked over to the terminal, saved the final session logs, and uploaded them to a secure personal drive. Not to share yet, but to keep. For himself. He looked at the drone and issued one last command. Power down. The device dimmed and floated silently into his backpack. He turned off the neural HUD, let the soft glow fade from his vision, and made his way down the long corridor toward the surface level. He walked slowly, his mind quiet. There was no celebration waiting, no crowd, just the sterile white light of the academy halls and the hum of quiet systems beneath the floor. Outside, the crystalline surface of the moon reflected the distant light of Calares 7 Darka. He stopped for a moment, gazing at the stars. Somewhere out there, the real Jürkens were still pulsing with unreadable stories, but now one had been heard, truly heard, and that was enough for now. Jack Lewis, the lone human in a class of galactic minds, had not shouted his intelligence across the cosmos. He had whispered, quietly, patiently, and in return the cosmos had whispered back.